Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for January 3rd, 2017. Happy New Year, everybody. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today, joined on the program via webcam, we have Mike Klepper with our AT&T consulting service, a new frequent contributor to our program. I think it's a few times you've been on now. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you.
How was your holiday and New Year? Everything went great?
Awesome. Got some sun, got some fun. Now I'm back at work, ready to get going again. So.
All right, sounds good. And joining me on the couch is Matt Kaiser, one of our AT&T security analysts. How you doing, Matt?
Doing great.
All right, good. And also Manny Ortiz.
Well, you don't care how I did.
Well, I know how your New Year's went and your vacation because we already had lunch together. So. And also on the couch with me is Manny Ortiz.
Happy New Year.
How's it going?
Not bad.
Thanks for being here. And I'm John Hogoboom, of course. And so let's just jump right into the show because I'm not one for all the social. Let's talk about how our vacation was. I'm more interested in security and IT stuff. So the first story that we're looking at, Manny, is one that you were looking at, Manny, about a new piece of ransomware, Popcorn Time.
Yeah. So this one actually came about like somewhere around mid-December, and it actually started off a little bit, and they dubbed it Popcorn Time, and I think some of us know exactly why they picked Popcorn Time as the name of the ransomware, because it's a popular, what we call it, a movie streaming.
It's a pirate service.
Exactly.
It's a pirate movie.
It's very well known for being able to get content for free.
Right. So very popular. So obviously enticing for people to download and find. And it was originally released like sometime back in, like I said, early December, mid-December. But when it was first looked at, it was kind of run-of-the-mill ransomware. There wasn't anything really spectacular about it. It did basically what ransomware did. And it wasn't until the second release of it that they had added a couple of little, nuances to it that made it interesting. It basically goes in and it encrypts your My Docs, your My Pics, my music, and anything that you had on your desktop. It would basically encrypt the files and then rename them to the FILOC, FILOC, .FILOC. In typical fashion, it would ask for 1 Bitcoin, which at the time was about $750. But if you've been watching,
Skyrocketed, hasn't it?
It has skyrocketed. So as of beginning
really?
of January, it's over $1,000 for a Bitcoin now.
You start investing in this stuff.
Yeah. So it's gotten quite expensive. And then there was a couple of things that they had noticed about the ransomware. So a couple things. So when the ransomware was launched, there was a couple of files that were put on your desktop, an HTML file and a text file. The text file had basically a description of what had just happened on your machine. And kind of why it had happened, which was interesting. So if you read through the article, it shows that they say that they are a bunch of students, computer science students from Syria.
This is in this HTML,
this is in this text file, right?
Interesting.
It is in the text file. The HTML file
providing their own attribution.
Exactly. The HTML file seems to actually be a mistake to put on because the HTML file actually has text within it that says something about the payment being received. So it looks like it was a mistake. Like that is what they use after you've actually submitted the payment. But the text file says that they are computer science students in Syria, and that the reason why they're doing this is because their country, blah blah blah. They've had a lot of people die in the recent past, and this is the only way for them to help themselves and their country. They needed to buy. I think they said that they needed to buy food and supplies and stuff. So it was a heartwarming story about why they needed to do this and why they needed
your computer.
Exactly.
Right.
And why they
Not
needed
sure I
your
buy this
money.
story.
They needed your money.
So that was kind of one of the most interesting parts about this when I was looking at this is that aside from the sort of humanitarian plea that they were using to try and make you feel somewhat better about paying the fee, also because they gave you the nasty way of getting out of the box, the humanitarian play to make people feel less guilty about passing on the infection in order to try and, get out of paying the fee themselves. So
Right.
I thought that was unique in whether it's true or not. It was a unique attempt at social manipulation.
Right, exactly. So Mike is explaining. So they had basically the sort of the nuance about this ransomware. Why it's more news than just your typical ransomware is because this nasty way that Mike is talking about was you either paid 1 Bitcoin and they unencrypted your files, or you could opt to. They would give you basically a URL, and if you sent that URL and infected 2 other people that paid,
Wow.
they would unencrypt your files for free.
What if they didn't? What if they didn't pay? You're still.
So it's like an affiliate program.
So you had to probably send it out to more than 2 people, right? To make sure that you got 2 people
Right, you
that
had to
actually
get at
paid,
least 2
so
people
that
that
yours
paid.
would get unencrypted.
No,
Interesting.
it's not a ransomware scheme. It's multi-level marketing.
Yeah, it's an amazing application of a Ponzi scheme.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't recall seeing that tactic used before. That's
Nope.
interesting.
Nope. So they basically give you, and supposedly, there's a couple of screenshots here, but they give you, the link that they give you is somehow tied back to the ID that they give you when they first infect you. So technically, although it wasn't tested, there is a way for them to track. If I sent it to you guys and you guys clicked it and paid, there would be a way to track it back to me to say, oh, that was the infection that I started, and those payments will make mine free.
Yeah, but
Right,
let's be
right.
honest. If you were to send it to both of us, 1, you're a terrible boss, and 2, we would be terrible security professionals to click on that link.
That's right.
So
That's right.
You have
Right.
to send it to more than
So you
just
can send
us.
it to your relatives instead.
Yeah, exactly. So in this, so the further tests, further tests on this, it turns out that the guys that actually tested this found out that the cryptographic key to unlock your files was actually located within the malware external. So they are actually
okay.
able to unencrypt their files without sending in money.
Right,
So,
right.
but that doesn't, obviously, as we all know here, that doesn't. The next version of it, they will fix
Yeah,
this.
they'll probably
Yeah,
fix
they will.
that.
And that won't be possible.
But somebody could probably make a standalone like recovery tool or something, like a security research,
Right.
good guy team,
Yep.
like antivirus, whatever, might come out with something at least for this. Interesting. Yeah, this is interesting that they that nasty way that you're talking
Yeah,
about. I don't think
it's
I've
the screw your
recalled
neighbor
seeing
malware.
that. Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, I mean, we've talked about, I think in the prediction show at the end of the year, talking about ransomware, probably expecting to see more of it. This actually came out in December, but hopefully it's not a harbinger of more to come, because ransomware is not, malware is not fun to begin with, but ransomware is even worse. So interesting. Okay. So let's move on to the next story, and this is one that you were looking at, Mike, about KillDisk malware.
Yeah, this is an interesting, an interesting variant of ransomware. We've seen a lot of ransomware over 2016. As you mentioned, we're expecting to see more of this in 2017. KillDisk is sort of an evolution of a pre-existing malware package that previously would go through and delete a victim's hard drive. So it was a very destructive piece of malware that was used in cyber sabotage type operations, cyber espionage operations, primarily focusing in the industrial sector. There was evidence of this being used in various areas, both in the U.S. and Eastern Europe over the last couple of years. But recently they have evolved this and their operations to take advantage of, what is on track, or was on track in 2016 to be the $1 billion a year ransomware industry, if you could term it that. And so now, rather than delete your disk and cause problems, KillDisk is actually encrypting the systems, encrypting the disks as well as any mapped drives of the systems that it infects. And it's demanding a very large decryption fee of 222 Bitcoins. So they are particularly targeting the industrial sector at this point, based on the available information that's out there. And this is interesting because you're seeing ransomware start to push into that IoT space, which isn't something that was terribly prevalent that at least I came across in my studies in the past year. It's an interesting evolution of ransomware as a whole, actually, because while banking and individual users and corporate users and things like that certainly have been juicy targets for ransomware, in the latter half of this past year, we've started to see ransomware move into more sensitive market verticals, like healthcare, for example, right? If you start to ransomware encrypt real-time operating, or medical support services and things like that inside of hospital infrastructures and what have you, there's a much more critical impact of that, right? When you start looking at IoT in like the chemical manufacturing vertical or the energy vertical, these are environments that, IoT is that next bow wave, right? Operational technology. There's quite a few challenges there from a security perspective. There's, possibly fewer controls depending on the environment. So it's easier to infect. The impact for infection and encryption is more pronounced, and they have deeper pockets to pay. And so really, this evolution is very interesting in that regard, that they're really kind of going after that vertical. Also, they combined this with a backdoor Trojan called from Telebot's backdoor Trojan that is used to exfiltrate data also as part of this. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch. The ransomware is being used sort of as a feint to draw attention. It's really flashy, right? It's very obvious. It grabs attention. Administrators may not notice the backdoor Trojan that's dropped in there as well, depending upon how thorough their investigation is. And this allows for possibly ongoing access to the environment post-infection, even after the ransomware is cleaned up. Also, it could result in doxing, right? So for those environments that get infected, have data downloaded, and it's encrypted, but they refuse to pay, depending on what that data is, whether it's incriminating in some fashion or trade secret or may otherwise have some sort of significant impact, the perpetrators can threaten to dox the organization, release the information to the public, to thereby further, encourage payment, right? And there was some speculation in the industry about 6 months ago as to where we were going to see that kind of trend start to arise in the ransomware area, and so this seems to be sort of a reflection of that. And the encryption that it's using is pretty thorough as well. It encrypts every file with its own AES key, and then encrypts the AES keys with an RSA public key, which you then get the decryption for after you pay the fine. So pretty interesting stuff from a number of perspectives in that way.
Yeah. So the KillDisk malware, and actually this segues really well from the last story. I didn't actually read the story ahead of time. So interesting, another ransomware. And this is kind of an evolution because KillDisk, is a lot of us are familiar with, has been used in a lot of nation-state type espionage. It was definitely used, from what I remember, in the Ukraine power grid attack. It was deployed on those machines as part of that. But that was the version that just wiped the disk. So now, like you said, they're kind of saying, well, instead of just wiping it, hey, let's see if we can make it a few extra bucks here. The other thing I thought was interesting here that you brought up is some of these verticals that they're moving into. So, we've seen a lot of the consumer one-off type of victims of ransomware in the past, but I would say in 2016, we saw a lot of healthcare. A lot of industries were being targeted, specifically ones that couldn't afford to have downtime and may not have the best. You would think hospitals would have better recovery procedures, but case in point, they may or may not, or they may not practice those recovery procedures as well as they should. And I think we covered a story late last year or just very recently, about the San Francisco municipal rail system that was also targeted, and now that actor was targeting a lot of other construction and business, more targets that were more small enough that they would probably pay, but big enough that they would have the money to pay, kind of thing. Yeah. And they couldn't afford to have downtime there. So interesting that they're trying to pivot this here into a ransomware tool as well.
It's no surprise that if, I think Mike had mentioned earlier a figure of like a $1 billion industry. Well, with a ransom of 222 Bitcoin, doesn't seem that right.
That's
doesn't seem that
pretty
far
steep,
off.
right? I can't do the math in my head.
Well, especially after the bump.
So
Right,
like,
after the bump, it's easy.
it's
It's
like
$222,000.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I was thinking 700. Yeah, I don't know who's going to pay that, but interesting.
Yeah.
A little alarming too. So like we said, the best thing anybody can do, even if you're just a regular user or a small business, is have good backup procedures for your corporate devices, and then exercise on some regular basis mock recovery procedures. Not necessarily want to kill all your machines, but at least test out the process. Say, well, I'm going to recover these 5 machines from backup today, and we're going to see how it works out and see if it all goes through as expected. Yeah. Because otherwise, when you're in the thick of it and you're not practiced in it, it's going to take longer. And if you do kind of exercise your recovery processes, you're going to be better apt to recover quicker and not have to deal with this kind of stuff. Hopefully, having good preparation can make ransomware kind of a moot point, but that's just my opinion. So moving on to what you were looking at, Matt. So I guess over the holiday break, you had some free time to watch some webcasts or seminars?
Yep, so the Chaos Communication Congress usually runs between Christmas and New Year's every year in Germany. Mm-hmm. And one of the nice things about that conference is that they stream everything. Maybe not the little meetings in the hallways, but any of the talks
right.
are going to be streamed in both in either English or German with live translation, sometimes in French, completely for free. So I usually make a point to set aside some time and watch a couple of the interesting talks. This year they were.
Do they have them recorded so you can watch them now
yep,
still? Okay.
With subtitles, and they do a lot of work after the fact to make it very accessible, and they put in titles and make it very glossy. But if you just want to watch the streams, you could do that too. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to just highlight a few of the talks I found interesting. I think most people should, if you're in this field and you're interested in learning a little bit more outside of your chosen area of expertise, there's at least one talk that happened this year that you could find interesting. The ones that I thought were interesting, Claudio Guarnieri did one called Hacking the World, and he came up with this idea called Security Without Borders, almost like a Doctors Without Borders, mm-hmm. knowing that we've talked about the problems with small and medium-sized businesses who don't have the manpower or the resources to dedicate towards security. Well, there are, NGOs and other organizations and journalists and people who could use the same kind of protection who will never be able to afford that kind of, expertise. So the idea is to pair up people who are white hats with people who have the need for, decent security and have them work together. So it's sort of a social responsibility if you want to volunteer your time
right.
to help out somebody who has a real need for that security. And I thought that was an interesting idea. Second talk is Radar Demystified by Pancake is the developer's name, but he's the guy who wrote the tool Radar. Mm-hmm. It's a command line environment a lot like IDA, except it's free. It's got a nice community behind it.
Yeah.
And I've always wanted to learn it, but it's a lot like learning VI at the same time.
I looked at it briefly. It looks pretty powerful. It looks good.
Very powerful, but there's a pretty steep learning curve. So this talk,
even IDA Pro has a pretty
absolutely
has a significant learning curve to it as well.
Sure, but at least you can click around and find things in menus. If you don't know your keyboard shortcuts in Radar, you're kind of sunk.
Right.
But this talk talked a lot about the popular ones you need to know, and then talked about the community around it. So other things you can try and load in, plugins and stuff like that. So that was kind of cool. I'm probably gonna have to watch that at least 2 more times. But I think I'm going to get a lot out of it.
Yeah, that sounds like a good one.
Console Hacking 2016, there's a group called Fail Overflow that's been very well known in game hacking, and one of their representatives was up on stage with a PlayStation 4, managed to get it to not only run Linux, which is quite an achievement, but also for fun he booted into Steam and started playing Portal 2 on the stage, which I thought was hilarious. So that's a fun one if you want to learn about the architecture of the PlayStation 4, great place to learn it. Another game-related one, I am a gamer, the Ultimate Game Boy talk was very cool. Someone took apart, and not just physically took apart, but showed the architecture of how the Game Boy worked, how the sound worked, how memory worked, how cartridges worked. If you ever want to see like the soup to nuts of a game console, this is the talk to look at. And then the last one that I thought was neat, of course, of the ones I'm going to talk about here, there are so many that were cool. But lock picking in the IoT was a talk about Bluetooth-enabled door locks. things you can
okay.
connect to with your phone, and whether or not some of the locks that were talked about aren't even very good locks in the first place. Like if they were designed primarily as an IoT device without the thought of how do you design a proper
the lock was secondary.
Right.
Right. So if you know a little bit about lock picking, you understand the idea of shimming a lock, which is basically bypassing the whole key portion of a padlock by sticking a piece of metal up towards the top and twisting and pushing things out of the way. All the money you've spent on your fancy lock has been bypassed with a little piece of metal from a tin can.
Right.
So there's both technical aspects of it, and there's still lock picking aspects of it. It was a really fascinating talk about how we need to get both of those right in order for a smart lock to be functional.
Right. You can't be an expert in one and not the other.
You need to,
absolutely.
look at both.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm not sure if we've had any lengthy discussions on this show, but talking about, obviously we're quickly moving into a full IoT world.
Yeah, especially home automation is going to be it's getting bigger and bigger.
Right, and companies that are popping out of the woodwork trying to do IoT, but are these companies IoT companies, or are they companies that specialize in the actual device themselves that they're making? Right. And so
you need to know both.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially if you've got something dangerous, like if you've got a great IoT toaster that you can control, and you can dial in the exact crispness of your bread. But if it burns your house down,
exactly.
no one's going to buy this thing.
Right.
So it has to be a proper toaster and a proper IoT device.
Right. Yeah. So those, I would say, if it was me and I was a company, you would think that some of the big vendors of locks would say, well, let's get some people that are really smart with security to come on board our company and help us, design these things, and we'll do the lock part, and they'll help us with the security aspects to make sure that all works out right. Interesting. Okay. Cool. Yeah, so I would recommend people check that out. I'm definitely going to check out the Radar one because, I looked at it once, and maybe that'll be my 2017. We didn't talk about
New Year's resolutions.
I forgot about that, but that might be my New Year's resolution is to do a little bit more of that malware, reverse engineering, and whatnot, because it's fun. So the last story, and this is kind of a segue into the internet weather, is there was some activity towards the end of December, and the NTP community pool. So out there's a pool of NTP servers. NTP is the network time protocol. This is how all of your computers kind of get their time synced, so all the machines have the right and correct time. And there's a global pool of these, and you can also have sub pools or whatever that sync to the time servers in your businesses and whatnot. But there is like a big community pool of several thousand servers or something. And they noticed a big uptick in the NTP request traffic that was coming in. It was a pretty significant uptick. Their chart doesn't show it as well on this little graphic I'm showing here, or at least not in a way that I can understand. I'm going to show you our view of it from the AT&T backbone perspective in a second. But it was interesting that they did some research here. They looked at it. They determined that the traffic was coming primarily from US networks, cable, cell phone providers, mobile providers like AT&T, Verizon, et cetera, as well as from DSL space, so other consumer type spaces. And then when they looked even closer, they realized, hey, it looks like a lot of mobile devices in general. It could be a mobile device on a home network going out, and that's why you'd see the consumer cable and DSL type stuff. When they actually figured it out fully, they actually took a bunch of Android devices, and they're installing these apps and trying to figure out what the heck is happening here. Where is this coming from? And they finally figured out it was in iOS, and they did this quickly within a day or something. They were able to figure out that on the iOS specific, Apple iOS on the iPad and iPhone, Snapchat released a new version 9.45, that had some kind of bug, we'll call it, that was trying to query the NTP servers more than it should, or more of them than it should. And Snapchat was notified. They have fixed it. They posted a fix to iTunes as of December 20th, and the update was rolled out to everybody's phone. If you haven't updated if you use Snapchat, I would say make sure that you've updated that so that you're not still running it. It looks like for the most part, things have quiesced back to normal again here, so that's a good thing. And this is actually the picture from the AT&T perspective. And you could see back around December 14th, 15th, we went from probably about 100 million flows per hour as just kind of a rough order of magnitude, to peaks of over 600, 650 at points here in between. And then it has since gone down, although it is a little bit more still elevated than it had been, which might be there's still a few devices out there. And when I say a few, it could be like several tens of thousands of them, or even hundreds of thousands, that still haven't updated themselves. But there was definitely a significant ramping up of activity there. But it's since kind of gotten better, at least to the point that it's not stressing out the NTP servers.
Did we ever get any information on what the bug was?
They go into a little detail. It's actually up in the GitHub repository. They were able to find the source code that related to it, but I don't really know why it was doing that. I didn't see that expressly mentioned. Although Snapchat acknowledged that, yeah, we had a bug. It's fixed. I don't know if I want to call it a bug. They said yes, this is responsible for this uptick in activity.
Misconfiguration or
yes,
something like that.
and they addressed it pretty quickly, which is great. And it's been since resolved. So interesting, though, that, I think it was pretty good work from the community. The NTP community is really kind of an open community. It's not a closed private, there's not like a private entity running the NTP servers. So, and that's another thing about NTP. If you are somebody who's interested in that and you want to help that project, you can go to ntp.org, I think, and find out about how you get involved with maybe sponsoring a server or providing servers to add to the global pool of NTP servers so that there's more of them out there and it can be distributed more across the internet. They can better absorb any of these types of events that might occur. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting one. So let's move on to the regular Internet Weather Report. And there are a couple of interesting things that have cropped up in the past couple of weeks that we probably hadn't seen before. Or if we had, I've completely wiped it out of my brain over the 2 weeks that we were on vacation kind of here off and on. So in terms of the most probe ports, not a surprise, 23 TCP Telnet is at the top of the pool here. However, this pie is smaller than it had been in the past. We had seen periods where it was like 75% of all scanning activity. So it's definitely come down a bit, but it's definitely not gone away by any stretch of the imagination. And then there's this 2323.1 port that's being scanned a lot. This has come up. The change is no different than last week, but that's because this started to ramp up prior to last week, and we haven't really talked about it since then, but we'll see it in a chart in a second. 6789 TCP, this is actually another Telnet port for the Dahua DVR system. They use that as their Telnet port because they, security through obscurity. Well, it's not obscure enough. Somebody found it, and someone's scanning to try to brute force password guess into those. 22 TCP is SSH. That's pretty much always on the radar. 5358 TCP is an interesting and puzzling one that we're going to take a much closer look at. And 3389 TCP is remote desktop protocol. That's usually on the list, people looking to see if they can find remote desktop services running on Windows machines and brute force their way in. 1900 UDP is simple service discovery protocol. This is probably scanning and attempts to find open SSDP services that they can use as reflectors for reflective denial of service attacks. 1911 TCP is the Tritium Niagara something.
AX?
So, yeah, it's that home, no, it's a building automation. Sorry, it's one of those.
HVAC? Or something like
it's not HVAC, but in any event,
Yeah,
it's one of those
we talked
building
about it
automation
before,
type software packages. And this 1911 TCP, for the most part, in all the scanning I've ever seen, has been researchers as opposed to bad guys looking for it. 80 TCP is web, and then 21 TCP is FTP. And there's lots of reasons that bad guys look for FTP. So this is the most sources program, which is indicative of botnet type activity, because you've got a large number of sources doing the scanning at once. And I'm just going to touch upon the ones that are really, which we've already talked about. All of these are pretty much on the port, the probe scanning ones. 445 TCP is in there as well. This is probably a lot of latent config or other types of bot scanning for Windows file sharing type stuff. The 5358 is in here as well. And then down at the bottom is the 7547 TCP, which is
The TR 069064.
Yes, it's probably related to that,
back.
which Mirai was scanning for as well. Most of these probably are Mirai or IoT-based bots scanning for all of these ports in general. The ICMP ones are probably mostly related to backscatter, where devices are trying to, scan sources are trying to scan for something, but then the receiving thing saying, no, I'm not there, I'm not listening on this port. So you get a lot of these ICMP messages that also look like scanning as well. So here's 23TCP. Like I said, it's not gone by any stretch of the imagination, but it has come down a bit. So we're seeing about 200,000 scan sources per hour, where there were peaks back here where we're like around 350 to 400 scan sources per hour. So it's maybe reduced. I'm not going to say it's in half. It's 2/3 of where it was before, but it's still a significant number of devices out there scanning for this. Some of that might be because now they're scanning for some other types of ports, and they're not concentrating as much effort on the telnet, the 23 TCP telnet scanning. So when we go to 23.23.1, which I don't have any specific vendor, I wasn't able to find any specific vendor for this, why they're scanning for this. However, the fact that 23 is in there, repeated twice, and we know that 23.23 was one that is a telnet-based one. I'm going to assume that there must be some device out there that's on 23.23.1 TCP that's telnet, that they use as their telnet service. These types of shapes that we're seeing here of this sawtooth decay early on, back around the early December timeframe, these were much smaller amounts, around 10,000 scan sources per hour doing this. But around 12/20, December 20th, it went up to about 70,000 scan sources per hour, which is pretty big. We're talking about 200,000 for 23 TCP. So this is probably Mirai or some other botnet composed of these IoT type devices like security camera DVRs, these network test storage, home routers, all these little embedded devices that people expose on the internet that might have some sort of default password provisioned on them. That's easy to guess. 6789, this is actually the same actor set, I think, from what I was able to determine, that was doing the 23.23.1 TCP scanning. Looks like they're also doing 6789 TCP. They were doing this a little bit before, earlier than they had been doing the 23.23.1 TCP. This is known to be a telnet port for the Dahua DVR, security camera DVR. So they run a telnet service on port 6789. Like I said, not necessarily the most obscure port to do it on. Really, there is no way to make something completely obscure by just trying to hide it on an unknown port, because somebody will find it by just port scanning the entire IP address. But anyway, so that's probably what's going on here. There's about 40,000 scan sips per hour at peak here when they first started up. Sawtooth waveform again here with this decay is a good indication that there's some sort of botnet-like activity. Faster bots finish earlier, ones that have better bandwidth. Ones that have slower bandwidth take longer to finish. That's why they kind of decay off in that fashion. And it seems to have kind of stayed at a steady state since about December 24th, around 25 to 30,000 scan sources per hour. And then the last one here, which I thought was a little interesting, because I'm not sure why they're scanning for this. So I don't really have a good answer here, but I did some looking around at who is involved in this. So first of all, 5358 TCP, the only thing I know that it's kind of semi-officially used as is the Web Services for Devices service, and I think that's a Windows service like Windows 7, or maybe Windows Vista and Windows 2008, or some older versions of Windows. And it's kind of like a port mapper type service. That's a layman's, if you're familiar with that. It's kind of similar to that in a way for Windows. There was an exploit back in 2009 for it, but I don't know that that's what's being targeted here, because that was quite a while ago, 8 years, 7, 8 years ago. The distribution of sources is pretty global. There's a lot of them. I'd say about 7,000 scan sources I'm seeing in about an hour. There's a lot of distribution around the world. However, there is a pretty decent concentration of them in Korea. Don't know why that is, although that the Korean ones appear to be these Max IO devices, which I'm not familiar with that vendor, but it looks like that might be the case here. Another IoT embedded type device, basically some sort of wireless router type device. There's a fair number of P2P device. Well, I should say a fair number of these also appear to be running peer-to-peer software, like BitTorrent, because they have distributed hash table type stuff going on there. So maybe this 5358 TCP could be related to BitTorrent, but maybe not. When I actually looked at some of these devices, and there's some other types of IoT devices in the mix too, but the Korean ones, which is a pretty decent, significant number of them, I'd say at least 20% of the 7,000 are in Korea, which is interesting. They are these Max.io devices, which are not really well protected, and they also have, I think we've talked about this before on some other vendor devices, but they have under their web interface this system command, which is basically like a web shell backdoor. So through a web interface, I can run like ls-l or ps-a and see what's, run command line functions, because there is no telnet open on these. So this is, if it is infected, this is a way that somebody could script something or manually infect it by using this type of functionality.
It's an intended feature of the device.
It's an intended feature of the administrative interface, but if you have a weak password, it's not good, because then anybody can kind of interact with it, command line, just like you would with telnet. And from looking at it, I guess I'm not familiar with this vendor Max.io, but appears to use the MediaTek MT7620 chipset, which is kind of like some all-in-one kind of
system on a chip?
Yeah, system on a chip kind of thing, formerly known as RA-Link. And so possibly there's something going on there, another type of IoT type of thing. Maybe these are getting scooped up and they're scanning for this 5358, but I'm not quite sure what they're going after in terms of the 5358 TCP part. Maybe we'll find out in the future.
You could technically scan for 5358 as a way to weed out to find the devices that you're looking for,
right,
with the knowledge they'll also have other ports open.
I think I did that on Shodan, and I didn't see anything on
if Shodan doesn't scan for 5358,
I think they did though.
Oh yeah.
I think they only had a very small number of hits, like less than 100.
Interesting.
But
they may have
I was looking at a lot of things with Shodan, so I'm not 100% positive that I remember exactly what I was looking at. So that's probably something good to follow up on. But anyway, maybe we'll figure out more as the weeks go on here, or maybe it'll go away, who knows. Just another example of, embedded devices, vendors need to be a little more careful about distributing them with default passwords. So that's the show for today. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com. You can also find the AT&T ThreatTraq program on the AT&T Tech channel. It's also available on YouTube and iTunes. Please follow us on Twitter. Our handle on Twitter is @ATTBusiness. I'd like to thank you, Mike, for joining us this week. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Manny. I'm John Hogoboom. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.